This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. You can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode is brought to you by the Animal Politics book series from Sydney University Press. I'm pleased to note that today's guest actually has a link to the series as he is one of the editorial board members. In fact, lots of names on the editorial board will be familiar to regular listeners of Knowing Animals. Other previous guests include Pablo Costello, Claire Palmer and Carol Gigliotti. So this gives you an idea of the kinds of books that are published in the series and the kinds of proposals that they might be open to. Today's guest, however, is Thom Van Dooren. Thom is a Professor of Environmental Humanities and the Deputy Director of the Sydney Environment Institute at the University of Sydney. He summarises his own interdisciplinary work as being about understanding and caring for the dead and the dying, including humans and animals, and including individuals, populations and kinds. He'll be known to lots of listeners for his contributions to extinction studies. His publications include the 2014 book Flightways, Life and Loss at the End of Extinction, and the 2019 book The Wake of Crows, Living and Dying in Shared Worlds, both from Columbia University Press. Today, however, we'll be talking about his 2022 MIT Press book, A World in a Shell, Snail Stories for a Time of Extinctions. Welcome to the podcast, Thom.
Thanks very much, Josh. Great to be here.
Can you start by telling us what led you to writing this book?
This book was sort of an accidental book in a way. It was certainly very serendipitous. It emerged out of basically time spent researching other books in Hawaii. I had been in Hawaii a few times over the years looking at birds, both for Flightways and for The Wake of Crows. In both of those books, it was the Hawaiian crow, the alala, that made an appearance, although I had been also looking at other birds in Hawaii. It was during one of those trips that a friend put me in touch with another friend in Hawaii with a professor named Mike Hadfield, who had been just running basically an informal snail ark for several decades at that point. This was in 2013 that I first met Mike. And so I went to, as I describe early in the book, I went to visit Mike to see these critically endangered snails in this lab that he had set up at the University of Hawaii at Manoa and became interested in them. And I guess it wasn't until about 5 years later that I started work on the book, but I wrote a few little things about the snails. I started doing a bit of reading about them, and I guess I was captured by the snails, by one snail in particular who I talk about in the book, George, who was the last snail of their species, Achatonella apex fulva. And so it was the snails themselves, I guess, in a way that drew me into thinking about them, but also the snail community. And I guess that's something that hadn't happened to me before, or that I hadn't appreciated before, the extent to which the community of people who surround particular animals or particular species, who can be more or less welcoming, as anyone knows who's done that kind of research with human subjects, as we call them. But in this case, there was something really about that community of snail biologists in Hawaii, as I got to know them, who were just so welcoming, so interested in having somebody come and engage with them, and who had so many interesting stories to tell. So I guess I was drawn in by them as well as the snails. And I didn't plan on writing a book. I thought I would write a book about extinction in the Pacific more generally. In fact, that's what I had grant funding to do, but along the way I got more and more interested and snails took over more and more of the book until they were the whole thing.
I've been thinking about how to pin down this book. In many ways, it's a work of nature writing, and you describe yourself as a field philosopher. But you also explain that this is a book that bridges traditional gaps between the sciences and the arts and humanities. This is a book about stories. In this context, what are stories? What's important about them?
Well, in a way, I think all of my books are about stories, and the use of the word stories in the subtitle of this book, Snail Stories for a Time of Extinctions, was very deliberate. And in my other books, I think Flightways is very explicitly sets itself up as a book about storytelling. And so I think, I have certainly tried always to tell stories because I value a certain kind of storytelling that I've spent a fair bit of time trying to think about as an accessible, memorable, engaging way of grappling with multiplicity, as a way of engaging with the world that doesn't force people into singular interpretations, that allows us to layer in multiple perspectives, human and non-human, and that allows us to hold that multiplicity, but also as an ethical work, storytelling as something that can engage us, that pulls us into relationship, into encounter, and so into accountability, I hope. So I think I have a very particular, I guess, relationship with stories and a very particular approach to stories and storytelling. And this book was an effort to do that, I guess, in a way just to do the kind of storytelling I've done in my past books. But I really wanted, in this case, to do it for a wider audience. My aim for this book was for it to be a popular book, or at the very least a kind of hybrid academic popular book. And so I spent a fair bit of time thinking about how to write it like that, how to do the kind of writing I had been doing in my other books in a way that it was a bit more appropriate, I guess, for a popular audience as well. So to move a little bit further along that spectrum, I guess, from trade to popular book in the popular direction, and what that would involve, how I would have to change the way I told stories to do that well. So this was, I guess, the book was sort of an experiment for me in how to do that, an effort to move in that direction. I made a big mistake, I should say, in writing the book about snails. That was, there's not a topic that has an immediate audience in terms of publics. And as I was told by numerous publishers who I approached with the book, I might have got away with snails if it had been a kind of global engagement with snails and, the quirky stories from around the world about snails. But to focus on snails in Hawaii was to make, a niche topic even more niche. And so in terms of an easily marketable popular book, I have the wrong subject matter. Nonetheless, I think as a sort of an experiment in how to tell stories that do that kind of, well, I think of it as nature culture writing, thinking with Donna Haraway's term of nature culture. There's certainly elements of nature writing there, but there's an effort to think in a way that, to think across nature cultures, to think not only about extinction as a process that involves climate change and introduced species and all of the usual kinds of ecological dimensions and dramas that we talk about, but that is also bound up with processes of, in this case and in many cases, colonization and globalization, militarization, and all of those other very human stories. So it's not nature writing, it's sort of out in the forest, experiencing the wonder and the majesty of nature. It has that, and I was captured by and tried to convey a sense of the wonder and mystery and incredible lives of snails, but in a way that never forgets, I guess, or that's always coming back to the very human dimensions of the story and the diverse human dimensions of the story. The fact that this is not about humans and snails. This is about different human communities tangled up in different ways, both as causes of the decline and as people trying to prevent the decline of snails, and as people who are suffering through the decline of snails in different ways. So yeah, that's what I guess that's the approach to something like nature writing that I'm trying to do. There are elements of the nature writing genre that I love, that I want to celebrate and try and embody in my work, but there are bits of it that I think we can stretch and redo. And part of that, as I've said, is the engagement with human diversity and complexity and history. But part of it is also a more thorough engagement with the humanities, with questions of ethics and politics and meaning, and trying to hold on to those in a serious way, and trying to ask readers to be willing to give them the same kind of attention and curiosity and concern that most readers of the genre of nature writing are willing to give to the biological sciences.
One of the stories which you return to throughout the book is that snails sing. It's there in the introduction, and it's there in the closing lines of the epilogue. What exactly is going on here?
Yeah, that's I guess an effort to engage with the stories of Kanaka Maoli, of Native Hawaiian people, and that's one of the strongest cultural resonances, cultural meanings that the snails have, or as certainly as it came up in my conversations with Kanaka Maoli. There are chants and songs and stories about the snails singing in the forest. My understanding of it, and certainly I'm no expert on Hawaiian culture, is that the snails are understood to have or take on a particular significance in many of these stories, that they don't just sing at any old time, that they sing often at sort of a climactic point in these stories. They sing as an indication that everything is pono, everything is righteous, correct and good, that things have been settled or resolved in some way in the story. But then other Native Hawaiian cultural practitioners have have told me about snails chirping and snails appearing in a way that sort of announces the presence of goddesses in the forest. So there are different resonances, different meanings that the snails have. And the book isn't an effort to catalogue or to try to explain native Hawaiian snail stories. And that, I guess, for me, as for many, when in Hawaii, I'd be haole, but for non-Indigenous folks thinking about environmental issues, I think again and again we come up against this difficult question of how to engage respectfully with Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous perspectives. What I wanted to do in this book, I guess what I settled on was that I needed to include those kinds of meanings and values and associations to the extent that I could. I needed to acknowledge that they were there and that they mattered. And as I try to explain in the book, especially drawing on interviews with a couple of native Hawaiian cultural practitioners in particular, the possibility of the breakdown of relationships that matter culturally as these species disappear, to try to give that weight and significance and make sure that's part of the story that I'm telling here, because it's part of why the disappearance of these species matters so much. But that's obviously not my story, and those are not my cultural meanings to delve into or try to explain. So there's an effort to keep them in the frame, keep them as part of the picture, but not to explain or make sense of them. And I guess that comes through most clearly in chapter 2 of the book, which is an effort to grapple with mystery in some ways. And that's certainly the mystery of what these stories mean and what it means to say snails sing in the forest, and what it means that some biologists at least will tell you that snails have no vocal cords and they certainly can't sing, whereas others will be much more open in different ways to the possibility of singing. And so that's part of the space of mystery that I wanted to grapple with in that chapter. But there are many other I won't ruin it, I guess, but there are many other mysteries that emerged in my conversations with biologists and native Hawaiians and others about snails. Many things that sort of just, I guess, can't be easily explained about, for example, how snails got to the Hawaiian Islands and so on. That's, I guess, the short answer, even though it's ended up being quite long, about what the singing snails are about. We don't know, but they're certainly there and very present in Hawaiian culture.
I'm glad you mentioned the snails arriving in Hawaii, because that was something that really stuck with me. You use the language of deep time movements of snails, and you also introduced the snail paradox. Something that really struck me was the idea that, completely contrary to what we expect snails to do, the first snails in Hawaii might have flown there.
Yeah, it's in many ways was the sort of, once I started to dive into the biological literature around Hawaiian snails, the topic that I found just most fascinating and absorbing was, where did all these snails come from? So, as I guess a bit of important background, Hawaii was once one of the most diverse, or had one of the most diverse assemblages of snails anywhere on the planet. And so there were at least 750 described species of snails, formally described species, probably many more, probably somewhere around 1,000, which means that those tiny little islands had 2/3 of the number of described snail species that are found in the whole of continental North America. So, in terms of diversity, the snails were just sort of packed in there. In terms of abundance, also, according to many early colonial naturalist accounts, they were abundant in terms of numbers too. The trees were just full of them. And they were very different to the snails that we, or many of us, are more familiar with. They didn't eat living vegetation. They, by and large, either cleaned the leaves, eating the fungi and algae off the leaves, or they helped to decompose the soil, decompose leaf matter and things into the soil, which before the arrival of earthworms relatively recently in Hawaii was a very important ecological role for snails to take up. So, they were particular kinds of creatures living in real diversity, real abundance in the Hawaiian Islands. And yet the Hawaiian Islands are these remote oceanic archipelagos. They formed over volcanic hotspots out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. They've never been attached to a mainland continent. How did this incredible diversity of snails end up out there? And so that's the story that I got interested in, and we don't have, no one was there, so we don't know for sure, but there's a lot of speculation. And as you say, the most likely scenario, according to most of the biologists who have spent time thinking about this, is that the earliest snails arrived on birds, that they were flown there. But others may well have moved high up in the air, moved around by strong winds. Some may have floated on logs, at least between islands. Some likely travelled in birds and survived the journey through the digestive system of the birds, as well as across oceans. So there's these incredible, unlikely journeys at the beginning as an origin story for the snails of Hawaii. But these would have been a handful of tiny ancestral snail species, probably about the size of a grain of rice, most of them, it's thought. And then only after they arrived in Hawaii did they become gigantic by snail standards, at least some of them, and begin to radiate and speciate and become the incredible diversity of snail species that the islands ended up with. So yeah, I was really interested in and captured by that story too, about how they got there and then how they diversified and evolved, and how Hawaii became this epicenter of snail diversity. And thinking, with that, as you say, deep time history as a really series of unlikely journeys that's produced these snails, that has produced this incredible phenomena. And so this, I guess, is part of an ongoing question that I've had in thinking with different species around the world. And I guess for me, there's a real resonance between the topic that I'm exploring there and the first chapter of Flightways, which is about albatrosses. And in both of those two chapters, in different ways, I'm trying to think about why species matter, about why, I guess I'm grappling with what is traditionally in philosophical discussions thought about as intrinsic value, trying to give my own kind of argument about, or to make fleshy and tangible in the particular cases of the albatross and the Hawaiian snails, how these vast evolutionary processes produce value in the world, or produce something that we might want to think about as value, produce these incredible, what I have called evolutionary achievements that we as a result of the utter unrepeatability, the incredible labor in many cases of individuals that hold each generation in the world and that bring the next generation into the world, that if we slow down with what a species is actually over evolutionary time, with how remarkable these things are over deep time, and not only all of what they have been through these processes of evolution and diversification, but also all of what they might yet become into the future if they're given the chance, that we can see these species making a claim on us, an ethical claim, to hold open room in the world for them, or at the very least not sort of carelessly blot them out.
This ties really neatly to the questions that were in my head when I was reading the final chapters of the book. Why do you think it's so important for us to actively be involved in the preservation of these snail species? Is it not a case for saying, well, we should just leave them to their decline?
Yeah. So that's that's a question that I also think about. And I have a pretty firm answer, I guess, which the book tries to work through, which is to say that I think that there are ethical obligations here to do the active work of holding open room in the world for these species. And so I guess in many ways the book is my effort to answer that question. To summarize, I think that the arguments for different species are different. And that's something that I decided early on in my work on extinction. And that's, to me, one of the foundational principles, if you like, of extinction studies, at least as I understand it, which is that every extinction is its own unique event. Every extinction is its own particular unraveling of lives and possibilities. And so every extinction needs to be storied and slowed down within its specificity. And Debbie Rose and I, who worked together on extinction for quite a while when we were both starting out our work on the topic, we thought about this in terms of the entangled significance of extinction. And so trying to give a sense of that unraveling of relationships that cuts across ecological and cultural, if you like, or human and non-human domains, to impact on ecological functions in different ways, but also to impact on traditional cultural practices of Indigenous people or livelihoods. So I think there are a whole lot of what we might think about as instrumental, in contrast to intrinsic values that are bound up with these species, and each of them differently. Each species leaves the world differently. So I guess rejecting the idea that we ought to make arguments either about the intrinsic value of species or about their instrumental value. I think what Debbie and I wanted to do in giving these kinds of biographies of individual extinction events was to pull those arguments together, to explore all of the different ways in which the disappearance of these species mattered, all of the ways in which they matter to others, but also they matter in and of themselves in terms of the experiencing subjects who are no longer in the world, the ways of being of these creatures that disappear from the world, and trying to give them some thickness and presence on the page so that we can begin to make sense of what's being lost, because I think that is the first challenge of grappling with extinction, is to give some flesh to the bones of these, or to add some thickness to these long lists of Latin names of disappearing species that become meaningless, effectively. So once we begin to describe the way of life of Acatenella apex fulva, this beautiful Hawaiian tree snail, once we begin to explain how it mattered to people in different ways, how it was used in the creation of Hawaiian lei shell necklaces, how it played these really interesting roles in the history of thinking about evolution and genetic drift and speciation. Once we begin to actually tell these stories, we see that there's a lot of different significances to the disappearance of these species. So that's, I guess, my argument. I don't about why extinction matters. I don't want to give a general statement that all extinctions are a bad thing. Of course, they're not. The vast majority of species that have ever lived on the planet are gone, and all species will eventually become extinct. So I think this is not an argument against extinction in the abstract. This is about slowing down with particular extinctions and thinking through why they've arisen and how they matter to whom, and then making a decision about whether or not we feel we ought to or have an obligation to do something about them. I think things become more complex when we start talking about things like Hawaiian snails, where, to be completely honest, even many specialists have trouble telling the difference between some of these species. If some of them disappear, there are others who will take up their ecological functions. The cultural significance of the disappearance of one of these tiny little brown species that may not even have been recognized as a different species by native Hawaiians, may not have mattered as a separate species. Its significance may well not be felt by many people. I think it will be, it's obviously noticed in some ways by the snails themselves. I think these questions become more difficult and challenging when we venture out of the world of mammals and birds and maybe reptiles and start thinking about the 99% of the animal kingdom that is invertebrates. And so that was also part of what I wanted to think about and grapple with in this book, is moving away from birds and thinking about how to tell the stories of why and how invertebrates, who often don't register as significant, are in different ways.
Yes, and that's something I can champion. There are so many stories we could dig into. We haven't talked much about shell collecting. We haven't talked at all about the US military involvement. But before we go to our regular questions, I think it's worth pausing and thinking about the snails themselves. I was intrigued to learn, and I'm quoting here, that snails are socially aware beings in their own snaily ways. Do you find yourself surprised at the complexity of snail life?
I guess I don't think I was surprised. I think that was one of the things I really wanted to do in the book. I'd come from writing a book about corvids, crows and ravens mostly, and hanging out with behavioral biologists, comparative psychologists who are doing really fascinating stuff with these birds, big, intelligent, social birds. And so, part of what I wanted to do was to think in a very different cognitive space about quite different creatures. And so, I think I was a little bit actually surprised by how little literature I found and how few people I found really, really diving into those kinds of questions with snails. And of course, no one with Hawaiian snails, partly because they're too endangered to do those kinds of experiments with. But, there's a handful of people, or at least I only found a handful of people asking what I consider to be really interesting behavioral cognitive questions about snails. And so, but yes, once I those people agreed to talk to me and I started reading their work, I was excited by what was there in terms of, people looking at how snails make meaning in the world, how snails preferentially read the slime trails of one another and preferentially follow others who might be reliable sources of food or good to mate with or other kinds of. So there are I think really interesting ways in which, and really interesting experiments in which people are trying to get into the worlds of snails. And I guess that's one of the things I found most fascinating, the challenge of getting into the worlds of snails. As one of the scientists who I reference in the book puts it, the challenge of figuring out what matters to them to enough of an extent that you can even figure out how to pose the question to them experimentally so that you can actually get some sort of meaningful sense of how they are making sense. And that, of course, with snails is really complicated by the fact that the vast majority of what they're doing is through their chemoreceptive instead of visual senses. So we really have to, right from the ground up, reimagine how they're perceiving and making sense, reimagine what it means to perceive and make sense of the world. So I found getting into the perceptual and intellectual social lives of snails incredibly challenging, and partly for the lack of literature, partly for just the the radical strangeness from a human perspective of snails, but really rewarding for that, for all that complexity, I guess, as a space of as a thought experiment, but also as an ethical project that tries to help us to think across difference, to think about how difference matters, how similarity often matters so much to us, and how we sort of ought to or can breach those kinds of gulfs, not just of understanding, but of caring. So that, I guess, was the project.
Well, as I say, we could talk for much longer, so I just implore listeners to get a hold of a copy of the book and see for themselves the diverse, distinctive stories about human-snail relationships on Hawaii. But Tom, for now, I ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yeah, and I'll try and be quick in answering, but I'm not known for my quickness.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Yeah, I'm not sure what pro-animal is, and I'm not sure that how I fit into that. But I'm certainly pro flourishing multi-species worlds. Peter Singer was the first, I guess, philosopher that I read writing about animals as an undergraduate, who we all read. But I would say Val Plumwood was the first person I read who came at animals in a way that worked for me.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Well, I think it was probably an essay I wrote on vultures, which was about the pain of extinction and thinking through extinction through a close focus on the actual painful deaths of individual vultures.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
I'm going to say Donna Haraway. Don't know if she's an animal studies scholar, but she's certainly someone who's widely engaged within the field. She has certainly shaped my thinking in many, many ways.
What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
I would just say to take them seriously in their work. Obviously, that means different things in different fields, but I think for animal studies scholars engaging with not only with biologists, but also with all of the other people who think seriously about try to understand animals is a vital task for us.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I'm going to be difficult here again and say that I'm not sure that there is a human non-human animal relationship. There's a diversity of relationships, and I'm not sure I know of any sort of simple general fixes that are going to do the trick. I guess my approach has been to try to cultivate a sense of wonder and appreciation for the diversity of animal lives. And so I hope that leads to more fulfilling, mutually enriching relationships.
What are you working on next?
A very short book at the moment on efforts by a group of really interesting biologists to teach a range of predators not to eat cane toads in the top part of Australia. Cane toads are obviously toxic, and they have been poisoning a whole lot of goannas and crocodiles and others in very large numbers across a lot of Australia. So this very interesting group of scientists have very successfully teaching these animals not to eat cane toads instead of trying to kill cane toads en masse.
How can people find out more about your work?
My website's probably the best place.
Well, thanks so much, Tom, for joining us for this podcast.
Thanks very much for having me. It's wonderful to talk to you, Josh.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can find us on X or on Facebook, and you can find me on X or on Instagram or on Blue Sky. My name's Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.